What is Last Epoch, and is it a game that you might enjoy playing? That's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to be going over the campaign, some of the mechanics of the game, overall itemization, and generally just talking about the game and if I enjoyed it or if you would enjoy it. As this was developed by an independent developer, I don't think it's fair to criticize things such as graphics, so I will be refraining from that, but anything else I consider fair game. Last Epoch is an ARPG, and it doesn't really seem to be setting out to make itself a different ARPG. It just wants to be the most ARPG-est ARPG ever. It wants to do it better than anyone else. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that means, you will, over the course of a game, get stronger and stronger items. You will get idols in this game as well. You will slowly put skill points into a passive tree. You will choose a subclass in this game, which is pretty cool. And you will have lots of abilities that your base class and your subclass can use in order to make yourself stronger. In this game, of course, you can also choose ability points for your abilities, which can get a bit complicated over time, but the general idea is you're going to start off weak and you're going to slowly build yourself over time over the campaign. It's not really that different from anything else you've played if you've played games like this before. All ARPG campaigns these days take on kind of the following idea. You start with the campaign, and then after the campaign, you get to the end game. Now, how interesting the campaign is and how engaging it is, how good its story is, varies game to game. And some games have better late games than other games. So then how is the campaign exactly? Is it fun? Is it long? The campaign is boring. Very, very boring. It's honestly one of the sloggiest, most boring campaigns I think I've ever played. It's only going to come down to about 5 hours when you're playing like I am and you just rush past everything. If you're actually trying to like watch the cutscenes, listen to the story, maybe talk to NPCs. If you're trying to actually stop and fight the enemies, it's probably going to take you as much as like 8 hours. At no point will it get interesting, and actually the campaign is still not finished. So the story just will end on a cliffhanger. It just ends. They just never finished it. If you do stop to try to actually listen to the story, it does seem like there could have been something interesting there, so that's kind of like a positive, but in a lot of ways it's actually like a negative. You think to yourself, man, if they fleshed out or spent more time on this story, on this narrative, maybe there could have been something interesting, but they just didn't. And I guess ARPG players just don't like having a nice story. So now there are bosses at midway points through the campaign. I would rate these bosses about average. They're not good, they're not bad. They definitely do seem like they were maybe made for people with slower reaction times. A lot of their attack windups are super slow. Even as I'm getting older and I can kind of feel my reactions tittering off a little bit maybe, I definitely had no issue dodging these. Most of the time, I just took the attacks and saw which ones did enough damage for me to actually react to. Because at the end of the day, they just turn into damage sponges. They're not interesting to fight, and they're just damage sponges. So at the end of the day, I'm just standing in front of them doing as much damage as I can, which just sort of adds to the tedium of the campaign. I really thought that ARPGs were getting away from this sort of thing, where they just start with this like huge long tutorial. But I guess not, and we're right back here. ARPG players will now say that, oh, who plays ARPGs for the stories? Who plays ARPGs for the campaign? I think some people do, or at the very least, some people did. If I'm gonna do a review video here, I obviously need to review this, because some people might actually think that an ARPG could have a story, could have a campaign. You've got Diablo 4, which had a story. The campaign was about, you know, is sloggy, right? Not really that interesting, very, very easy. Path of Exile 2 did have some challenge in there, and it's interesting to play through it. The story is fine, serviceable in Path of Exile 2, but this game does not seem to have either of those. It has no good writing. It doesn't really emphasize the writing at all, and of course, it's just a boring, very outrageously easy slog. These are literally just the same opinions that ARPG players have. Here is a post on the Last Epoch Reddit, one of the top posts of all time, talking about the game being easy. They are saying that it is a loot pinata. They are saying it is very easy, even compared to its counterparts, and ARPGs are already pretty easy games. So this is an extremely easy game to not only be talking about bad things in the game, but we will go back to the tutorial later. Let's talk about items. From a game design perspective, I actually think the items in this game are quite better than they are in similar ARPGs. The 6 effects on an item I think is way too many and allows way too many degrees of randomness, and I just generally don't like that. This game does 4 that you can have in an item, and I think that that's just a much better and more manageable amount. Don't think that you get less effects or cool things on your character. There are many uniques with many unique effects. You can find lots of them. And for character customization, of course, we have over here the idols. Idols come in generic categories and categories specific to your class. Classes in this game are a lot more definite than they are in maybe a game like Path of Exile 1. You have a class, you have a subclass, you have abilities for that class, abilities for that subclass, items for that class. This one's a sentinel helmet. Only sentinels can get this one. Here's a sentinel huge idol that affects specific sentinel abilities. I actually prefer that system entirely. When abilities are usable by everyone, they tend to need to be way weaker, and they tend to need to be balanced around only the most overpowered people who can abuse them. When you add restrictions to games like this, it's significantly better. So here we can see an idol that gives me symbols of hope, active duration, symbols gain rate. I just think that this system is way better. I like the restriction. I'm not gonna, go over all the abilities right now, but I'm just saying generally, I do like the more restrictive system. I generally also like how, for example, here's Sentinel items can interact with the Sentinel abilities without kind of diluting the pool for other classes, so that's really good. I also like here how the Sentinel idols, which kind of form the second half of your kit, because we only have 4 effects here. So here we've got these other effects. This allows you to upgrade your character. I really like this system as well. You can kind of, you min-max your idols to affect the abilities you want them to affect. It's just, I think that this is just way better. So far as item crafting, everybody raves really nicely about the item crafting system in the game. I went ahead and picked up a fresh item so you guys could look at it. All items will have forging potentials, which will be random. You can add any stats as long as you have runes for it. I like this system as well, not just the crafting, but the runes themselves. Early in the campaign, you might just, you want melee fire damage and that's it. And generally this is, flat damage will generally be the best stat throughout the game. So it's not the best, I guess, example of it, right? But you will get more powerful runes with more powerful attributes as the game progresses. So you can kind of do more wild things. Like you can see over here, here's an attribute that gives +2 to healing hands and increased healing effectiveness. So that ends up being quite strong. Here's another one that gives flat health and percent health. So that one's rare. You might need to farm up modifiers for it to put it on more of your items. That one's, just obviously more powerful than a flat health modifier, right? This system works really good. As for item crafting, of course, as long as you have the runes for it, you can add anything to anything. You've got different scrolls that you can use to try to modify your items. You can see this uses 1 to 18 forging potential with another 25% to not have any cost at all. So there's obviously a degree of randomness. You can see it only used 1 there, a good hit, right? This allows you, because you only got the 4 modifiers to begin with, right? When you combine this with these different runes that you can add onto your items. I'm not going to go too much into it. I'm just going to say the crafting system here is pretty good, pretty nice. Yeah, there's generally, in my opinion, there's no downside to it. It allows you to get what you want pretty consistently, allows you to upgrade your gear. There's 2 downsides that now I want to go over. The first downside, in my opinion, is actually the unique and legendary system. Any unique can drop with unique potential. Do I actually have any here? Legendary potential, right? A unique with legendary potential can have 2 different modifiers added to it. So here we have 2 legendary potential, 2 different modifiers can be added to it. The problem with the legendary potential system is that, and if you go look at any streamer or any top tier character, you'll see exactly what I'm about to say. The problem with this legendary potential system is that it means that uniques, which are already quite powerful, have a chance to roll unique potential. They can roll 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. 4 is obviously quite rare. Once we're starting to add these powerful modifiers onto these uniques, which are already pretty powerful items, everyone's inventory kind of gets full of uniques. The item crafting system does have a definite downside now, because as we start reaching the late game, people will start just finding this is the best unique for this class. This is the best unique to use, just period. In my inventory, I've got full of 4 legendaries, and if I wanted to continue, I got to 300 corruption, so don't think I ended my run early. I went pretty far into this run, but even me, I managed to find 4 different uniques, managed to put different things on them. If I wanted to continue grinding, I think there's 4 more legendaries I could put into my gear, and once you're doing that, the problem starts to become how the legendary potential works. This item has 2 legendary potential. How does that work? You always get to choose 1 modifier that you put on the item automatically, and the other ones are are random. This means once you reach a late game, you're going to be spending all your time farming to get items that you then try to craft, and then once you craft those items, you're slamming them onto your neeks to try to get a good roll. It starts being really, really grindy and not that fun, and then it also kind of starts running into the issue where you're filtering out 99.9% of items, which I'll also get into in a second. You're filtering out all these items. You really realize that the only best items you can get, the only ones that are even worth having anymore, are the ones that roll the really good modifiers, and then you need perfect items, and then you slam them on your items, and oops, the bad modifiers went on it, oops, tough luck, and then you gotta go do it again and grind to get another 2 or 3 legendary potential weapon. You gotta do it again, and you gotta do it again, and you gotta, as everyone's just starting to fill up everything with uniques, player creativity takes a nosedive, and it starts becoming you're slamming the items in, you're just slamming them at the end of the day. You're just hoping for the best, right? It starts as a really good system and starts to teeter off as time goes on, but I do like the item system as a baseline concept. Now, there is a fatal flaw in the item crafting that nobody wants to talk about. That is that during the campaign, you will rarely have to do item crafting. You've seen just how easy it is. You will item craft the bare minimum just to keep your damage up to get through it. Once you're done with the campaign, you will go to the monoliths. You start at the bottom, and you have to clear through these random maps all the way to the top. Go in. Yeah! This is now what people would call the mid-game. Do you need to do item crafting? Is it now challenging? Of course not, it's not challenging at all, and you will have to grind each monolith. You need to do maps on the monolith until you build up enough stability to fight the boss at the end. The boss at the end is obviously not going to be very difficult, and you need to do this over and over and over again on each monolith. No challenge, nothing. It's a mindless slog to get through. At this point, item crafting is still not very important. Finding upgrades is really only good for trying to get you through the campaign a bit faster. Now, something good about the game, what kept me playing it through the rather tedious and boring gameplay, was that the developers seem to be very good at giving the players the power fantasy they want. If you choose to be a sentinel, you will be tanky and you will overall be melee, although there are some ranged options. When you choose to be a paladin, you get lots of holy fire damage, you get lots of healing, auras, buffs, things like that. It feels very much like how you would want a paladin to feel. The developers, they have a very good idea what the players want, and they have a very good idea to give players that fantasy. Now, when you choose your class at the start of the game, you unlock a passive tree from there in which you can put points into it. Sometimes you just put points in them and get buffed. Sometimes if you put a certain amount of points in them, you'll get a second buff. Some of these can be quite impactful, like being able to dual wield. Subclass allows you to put as many points in that as you want. You then can also put points into the other subclasses to a limited amount. So there's a lot of diversity in here. There's a lot of choices you can make. There's lots of different things you can do. So far as balance, well, I chose to be a paladin, a sentinel paladin. They seem to be very, very, very overpowered. If you actually go ahead and you look at the hardcore ladder, you might notice something about the hardcore ladder. It seems a lot of other people noticed how broken the paladin was. If you look at the normal ladder, you'll also notice a similar thing of lots of void knights, falconers, forge guards, that's another sentinel, void knight, void knight, void knight, void knight, void knight, void knight. The balance in this game is okay. The main thing that this game does, seemingly, is trick you into thinking that everything is viable and every option is explorable. But realistically, that's not true. It's just as bad balanced as any ARPG. Doing the uber bosses at the end of the game, pretty much everyone has decided to use Void Knight or Paladin to clear through them. So the balance isn't exactly perfect, but it is an ARPG, and ARPGs tend to not have the greatest balance. But what we do sacrifice in order to gain everyone feeling strong is that the game is very, very boring. It doesn't really have a lot of gameplay depth to it because the developers want everyone to be able to get through the campaign, even with bad builds. They want everyone to feel powerful through the campaign, even into the monoliths, even with bad builds, even with poor skill choices. And that's great, but it also means that people who did go with good builds are bored out of their minds. People who did go with good options are bored out of their minds, and the only option left to them, the only thing they can do, is try to speed run through the content as much as they can, until eventually way down the line, we're gonna hit monoliths with corrupted, and that is when the game can start to get, at the very least, the tiniest bit interesting. I want to take a small detour to talk about something I do like that Last Epoch does a lot, is that many ARPGs have almost the entirety of their character progression in items. This can mean that nothing really other than items feels interesting, and how good your gear is determines 100% how powerful your character is. It can get a bit boring to have a system like that. Last Epoch, in addition to having this idle system here, which I actually really do like, uses some other ways to scale up the player. For example, each time you clear a monolith, you can get a permanent buff from a pool of buffs. These can be things like amulet drop rate and grand idol drop rate, but it can also include things like chance to ignite on hit, which is really strong, flat mana of a very high degree, there's one-handed sword drop rate, there's prefix shard drop rate, but over here we have increased physical damage 94%, 144 endurance threshold, 167 armor, 20% increased class specific shard drop rate. You get the idea, right? I like the progression being distributed more amongst more systems, because it doesn't mean we're only looking at items. I do very much like this. It makes it feel much more complicated and interesting to me. And I just, from a game mechanics perspective, this is another thing that I really like. To double down on things I really actually think is good about the game is the ability to customize your abilities. And I don't just mean things like giving a heal increased healing effectiveness or reducing its mana cost, increasing its AoE. None of that. I'm talking about things like outright changing the damage type on an ability into fire and changing its bleeds into ignite so that this ability can fit into a fire build instead of only being in a physical build. Here we can change it into a void build, and that just allows you to do a lot more interesting, diverse things, and means that classes don't get gated as much, where it's like, I'm going a fire build, here's the fire abilities, I can't really do anything other than that. You can change a lot of different abilities into things that could work in your kit. They also can allow some abilities to do wildly different things. So for example, here we have healing hands, which is a heal, but over here instead we convert it into a melee attack, and then over here we convert it into a melee attack that procs whenever you use another melee attack, casting a heal every time I attack that also does damage, which probably actually isn't even remotely balanced and can trivialize the game a lot. But, you know, it's fun to do, I guess. The last monolith you clear before you start doing corrupted monoliths is level 90. When you start doing corrupted monoliths, they will now be level 100 with 100 corruption, making enemies do, I think that's about 100% more damage with 100% more life. This is not paced very well at all. This is of course at the end of the early game, at the end of the mid game, and finally the game gives you a little bit of pushback. The problem here, and I've seen this a lot in general chat, and I've seen it from talking to other people, if your build is bad, at this point the game has given you no notification that your build is bad. It hasn't given you any pushback at any point in time. If your damage is significantly too low, if you're not tanky enough at all, or if your build is just miserable with points allocated terribly, the game has never given you any information that you're doing things poorly. The entire content has just been so easy until this point that what normally happens in other games, let's use Dark Souls as an example here. If you go into a wrong area in Dark Souls too early, the enemies will be very tanky and they will have a lot of health, which generally means I'm not in the right area. Lots of games will use this sort of information to tell the player you're doing something wrong. In other ARPGs, you might start realizing your damage is just simply not good enough. You need to improve your gear, or you just need to allocate your points better, or do whatever that game does to scale your character better. This game just never does that right up until you hit corrupted monoliths. It's a huge flaw, and it really does need to be talked about. Believe it or not, I actually enjoyed when the game gave me a little bit of pushback. I noticed, ooh, something's not right here. Like, I'd been obliterating the content before this, and then I got to the corruption stage, and I was like, oh man, I don't feel so great. So I went back to the drawing board. I tried to look at different weapons I could pick up. I went dual wielding. I noticed that on hit, even from one weapon, will apply to both weapons. So you put an on hit on both weapons and on your ring, you can get on hit everywhere and start doing absolutely insane damage. I started to look into how the endurance work. I endurance stack, so I couldn't really get burst down, and I was far tankier with less HP. I actually started to enjoy the game at this point. But what I did notice is once I started massively reallocating all my points, all it did was completely re-trivialize the entire game. See, I'd been allocating my points in completely inappropriate areas because the game was just so easy. Once I actually felt some challenge, I went back and looked at my build and fixed it up a lot, and the game got a lot easier, like I just kind of ruined the game for myself. So here I was, like 40 hours into the game for myself, playing through corruption, getting to 200-300 corruption, I think at this point. I was using uniques, upgrading them to legendaries. I was doing all this, and the game, instead of getting more and more difficult, was just getting easier and easier at a pace which I was actually outpacing. Instead of clearing through the content and getting to higher corruption being harder, I was actually getting easier and easier for me over time, which honestly, that's when I finally got bored of the game. To summarize the entire video then, Last Epoch is a game which has made many good decisions. However, it has one terrible decision that overshadows everything else. By making the game just so easy and abusing your time so much to get to the point of any challenge, it just kind of wastes everything good it does. The very nice item crafting system is wasted because for the majority of the game you don't need it, until which point you'll typically start having uniques, and then you'll start turning those uniques into legendaries. There's only a very small period of time where the crafting system is actually needed. The build system and creating fun builds is nice, and you can spend the majority of the game with your build doing whatever, but then you'll hit this very high difficulty hurdle where you might be so far out of whack with your build that there might not be anything you can do to save it at that point. Overall, the gameplay itself is just so non-challenging and boring that at no stage we really feel threatened with anything. It really seems like the game is only made for true ARPG aficionados, the people who've been no-lifing this sort of gameplay forever, which is probably good for ARPG players, but doesn't seem to be inviting anybody into the genre who isn't already in love with this exact specific gameplay. So, as always, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment down below on any of your thoughts, and I hope all of you have a great rest of your day.